Let's talk about some definitions that are important to understanding risk. Let's talk about assets. First, assets are anything of value to the company or the organization. Assets can be intellectual property, they can be physical systems, they could even be vehicles. They could be credit card information. Any vulnerabilities can be weaknesses, the absence of a safeguard, lack of training, inability of an employee to not click on a phishing email, or open an attachment that has malicious code in it. Threats can be what actually caused the loss to an asset. Normally, there's a percentage loss. So a total compromise of an asset would be 100%. Partial might be 90%. So these are the real threats perpetrated by threat agents who carry out the attack. So threat agents, like hackers and nation states, as well as advanced persistent threats, APT groups, will use exploits. Exploits are instances of a compromise. So some exploit code that takes over a system. So like the NSA's Eternal Blue or Double Pulsar, to compromise the system or to get a foothold or a beachhead for a larger operation. There's always the element of risk. So what's the probability or likelihood of the threat materializing? We use the different controls, technical, physical, administrative, that we mentioned to try and prevent those things from occurring. So we put those safeguards and countermeasures in place to reduce the risk. So you can look at the different threat groups that are out there. You can go on FireEye's website. They have a who's who listing of APT groups. You can see what nation: North Korea, Vietnam, China, what malware they use, what their target sectors are, and what are their attack vectors. So let's look at some sources of risk. So one of the sources of risk could be, of course, a lack of training. There's, of course, the disgruntled employees, like the Edward Snowdens of the world or the Reality Winners of the world. We have a weak or non-existent antivirus software. Much of the antivirus software becomes a target itself for malware, so it's entirely possible that the malware detection could be turned into an attack vector or outright just disabled. There's also the problem of poor physical security if people don't know to check for IDs or challenge individuals that should not be in a certain space. Other sources of risk, of course, no change management. You might hear it called CM. Change management's designed to basically prevent unauthorized changes to a network. So change management means we don't just make changes willy-nilly and then all of a sudden something happens and there's no record of who did what or who made what decision. Nobody writing down what actually was happened or what actually was done. Lessons learned. There's also the problem of a lack of hardening systems. So system hardening involves good patch management, proper configuration, setting the right registry keys, turning off unnecessary services. Of course, poorly trained users, people are the number one weakness in any organization as far as downloading attachments, opening up things they shouldn't, weak passwords, reusing passwords. So all sources of risk. Then there's risk management. So risk management is the process of identifying, analyzing, assessing, mitigating, or transferring risk. So it's the decision process. So the main goal is to reduce the probability or the impact of risk. So summary topics, it includes all the risk-related actions. Risk management is the overarching umbrella under which the other controls fall. The main goal is to reduce the risk as low as possible through ongoing assessment, ongoing analysis, and mitigation of risk through controls, and then having an ongoing risk monitoring program. So let's look at some of the components of risk management. First, you've got risk assessment. So you've got to identify what assets you have. You have to put a value on the assets. Sometimes the asset value is intangible, but you have to figure out what threats and vulnerabilities you have. Then you have risk analysis. So different ways, once you know what you have and know what weaknesses you might have, then you have to look at the risk analysis. So what threats are in your risk model? You want to model relevant threats, because threats that are not relevant, they're going to waste time and resources that you could be using to monitor against actual threats. So you want to look at the risk analysis perspective. So we'll talk about quantitative versus qualitative, and we'll talk about risk mitigation versus risk response. We'll also talk about different strategies that you can use to manage risk. So how can we mitigate risks and also do some incident response, some triage? So there's important strategies when you mitigate risk. So you can reduce risk through security controls. You can avoid risk by not doing risky behavior. Just like not driving your car down a busy street. You're reducing some risk, but how long are you able to do that for effectively as a business? Of course, transferring the risk somewhat, outsourcing. And then lastly, if the cost of the controls, if it's not worth the effort, then accept the risk. So you get the stakeholder to sign off on it. And then you have the ongoing risk monitoring phase. So once you know your risk, then you have to continue to monitor for new risks and new techniques. So now we're going to talk about the risk assessment. The risk assessment is important, and the risk assessment is valuable. We have to do it in the organization to make sure we know we're protecting, what we're protecting, and what's it worth. Is it valuable to the company, the competitors? What lengths would they might go to get access to it? Think about the kind of damage if something like that's compromised. So how much time was spent on development of the product, and how much harm would there be done? So also things like compliance and legal issues. Obviously, there's legal considerations for risk as well if your customers or your clients' data gets spread out all over the dark web. So let's look at some of the different ways to do the risk analysis and the risk assessment. So we first have to determine the value. If we're talking about qualitative risk, we're talking about probability times impact. What is the probability of something occurring versus the impact? That means how likely is it that something is going to happen, and what would be the damage? You might hear it called likelihood and severity. U.S. military likes to talk in terms of something impacting national security, for example, is something that's classified. Could it cause grave damage or exceptionally grave damage? But the risk level and probability will be different depending upon your organization. And you want to model the relevant threats to your organization. Quantitative is going to be more calculation based. So qualitative analysis is more subjective, and it's based on your best judgment, whereas quantitative analysis is numbers driven, and it's more objective. So let's first talk about qualitative analysis. So you've got probability times impact. These are rough estimates and not exactly an exact science. So you have on the right hand side, the diagram here, you have severity moving to the y-axis and the likelihood So as it moves to higher likelihood, the severity goes up. Things like information integrity loss, information disclosure, loss of availability. So the subjectiveness uses words like high, medium, low of a threat exposing an actual vulnerability. The Delphi technique is often used to solicit expert opinions. The Delphi technique is often used to solicit objective opinions and get subject matter experts in order to score certain activities being a higher risk than others. So quantitative analysis requires more experience than with qualitative, and it involves calculations. So if you understand the calculations of how to arrive at the dollar value associated with each event, you can make the business decisions that get, or assist in making the business decisions on this type of analysis. The goal is to look at the dollar value of a risk, use an amount that determines what's the best control. So you have to calculate also the value of the asset and the exposure of the asset. So it's important to look at the return on investment for a particular control. If the cost of the control is more than what you're protecting, then it's not worth the risk and it's a bad return on investment, or ROI. So let's first talk about the asset value. These are some important definitions to be aware of. So AV is the abbreviation, essentially how much the asset is worth. Then you have EF, or the exposure factor. So this is the essentially what percentage is loss due to an exploit. Then you have the annual rate of occurrence, how many times it occurs. So the annual rate of occurrence is how many times per year it occurs. If so, for example, you were to have 5 occurrences over a period of 2 years, the annual rate of occurrence would be 5 divided by 2, which would be 2.5. If you had 1 occurrence every 2 years, then it would be 0.5, 1 out of 2. Then you have single loss expectancy, which is the how much from a single loss in dollars. So you take the asset value times the exposure factor. The annual loss expectancy is the amount that is lost per year. So you take the single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence. And on the bottom screen, you can see different variations of the equation. So the main equation is annual loss expectancy equals single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence. So if you want the single loss expectancy, divide ALE by the ARO. If you want annual rate of occurrence, divide ALE by SLE. If you have any of the two variables, you can calculate the third. If you have the asset value and the exposure factor, and they give you the annual rate of occurrence, then you could calculate the annualized loss expectancy. So there are 3 general acceptable responses for mitigating risk. You can reduce risk. So you can reduce risk by controls. You can transfer risk, so outsource it to a third party. Purchase some kind of risk insurance like Cloudflare. And then you can, lastly, if the cost of the controls is more than what you're trying to protect, then you can just accept the risk. You might have, in some cases, secondary risks, which are those risks that arise at the outcome of implementing some type of risk response. So you could purchase risk insurance, but you give up some type of control by outsourcing to an extent. The residual risk is what is left over after you implement your controls. Then you must continue to monitor for risks, because risks and vulnerabilities will always continually come up. So mitigating risk becomes the basis for governance and policy. Let's talk about security governance. So the IT Governance Institute, in its board briefing on IT governance, Second edition defines security governance as follows. Governance is a set of responsibilities and practices exercised by the board and executive management. The goal of providing strategic direction, ensuring that objectives are achieved, ascertaining that risks are managed appropriately, and verifying that the enterprise resources are used responsibly. So NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology, defines information security governance as involvement in maintenance of frameworks to assure that information security strategies support business objectives and are consistent with applicable laws and regulations, through adherence to policies, internal controls, and also providing assignment of responsibility, all to manage risk. So these are some of the different blueprints or frameworks for achieving IT governance, both international standards and some best practices. You have the British standard 7799, which ended up becoming ISO 17799. And what we know today is the 27000 series. If you're looking at international standards in the US, you'll most likely go to the ANSI website. Type in ISO 27001, for example. There are many other standards that the International Standards Organization creates, but if you're looking for security management standards, best practices for establishing, implementing, monitoring, reviewing, maintaining, and improving an information security management system. Then you have also other standardizing organizations. You have COBIT, which stands for Control Objectives of Business and IT. So if you go to ISACA's website, you can look for getting certified in COBIT. They also have other certifications. COBIT is their right-sized governance solution. And they have additional documentation and certifications for and case studies you can reference there. So you have COSO. The Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. Then you also have the OCTAV model, which means the Operationally Critical Threat Asset and Vulnerability Evaluation. This is a framework for managing information security risk. Finally, you have the IT Infrastructure Library. So the ITLibrary.org, this is the open source guide to it. So there are different ISO standards that apply to the ITL library. Now let's talk about COBIT, COSO. You need to understand the acronyms for sure. So COBIT stands more for the control objectives. They both focus on similar things, but they are two different frameworks. So that needs to be made clear. Now, CISSP does not expect you to know every single ins and outs of these frameworks. It expects you to know the frameworks and a little bit about them in the acronym. And we have the ITIL, or the IT Infrastructure Library. It defines the organizational structure and skill requirements of an information technology organization, and also has a set of standard management procedures and best practices to allow the organization to manage IT operations. In other words, we're talking about best practices for people, technology, processes. ITIL was originally created by the CCTA under the auspices of the British government, and ITIL is a registered trademark of the UK government's Office of Commerce, usually called OGC. And there are 5 service management publications. ITIL in its current version, version 3, has 5 volumes: ITIL Service Strategy, ITIL Service Design, ITIL Service Transition, ITIL Service Operation, and ITIL Continual Service Improvement. These books can all be obtained from their respective publishers. So the publications are not testable, but its purpose and comprehensive approach are testable. It provides best practices and the means to implement those practices. The 2 most common used data sets are the service support and service delivery. So the octave model, the operationally critical threat, asset, and vulnerability evaluation model. This came out of Carnegie Mellon University. You can see here the octave model on Carnegie Mellon University's website. You can download the PDF. It's also part of a bigger collection of resources, which you can download as well. So different adaptations of the octave approach. So then we have the British Standard 7799-1 and 7799-2. So the original 7799 was split into 2 parts. Part 1 was a code of practice for information security management and included a number of potential controls that, if in place and working, would provide formally managed information security. Part 1 was a supermarket of controls, some of which would be relevant, others not, depending on the business. Part 2 is a specification for putting in place an information security management system. Same way you can manage a firewall, you can manage your overall information security. In 2000, Part 1 became an ISO standard. The content remained basically a code of practice, but it's not possible to be certified in a code of practice. Part 2 remained a British standard, and organizations can still be certified to it. Certification proves that to any interested parties that an organization is managing its information security. So then we have the ISO 27000 series. You can see the ISO 27001 is the establishment, implementation, control, and improvement of an information security management system. It follows the Plan, Do, Check, Act model. ISO 27002 replaced ISO 17779 or 799. Provides practical advice for how to implement security controls. And there are 10 domains to address the information security management system. ISO 27004 provided metrics for ensuring the success of the information security management system. 27705 was a standards approach based to risk management. And 27799 are directives on protecting personal health information, or PHI. So the Plan, Do, Check, Act model is part of the Lean Six Sigma methodology, but essentially the plan portion, these are best practices for information security governance. Let's talk about the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. This is a 4-step model for carrying out a change. So there's a little bit of crossover from Lean Six Sigma or project management, but so just like this graphic depicted here, this circle, this process essentially has no end. So it's considered a project planning tool. And effectively, once the cycle completes, you just keep on repeating and repeating. So the plan phase, you establish the information security management system. You implement, operate, and then you check, monitor, review the information security management system. And then finally, you act to maintain and improve. So what commonly is referred to in military terms, we call it install, operate, and maintain communication systems. So it's very similar to, so once you implement the system, you have to continuously monitor it. You have to try and work to improve it, the updates, and the inputs and outputs. You've got requirements that go into the circle, and then you have individuals that have a stake in the matter of the information system. So be aware of that for the exam. So now we have a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. So with a top-down approach, essentially security practices get directed from the top, from the senior management level. So it starts from the senior management, works its way down to middle management, and back to the staff. So the bottom-up approach, the IT department essentially tries to implement security. So the changes start from the bottom. So what is the role of your senior management? You've heard me talk about it already. I've talked about stakeholders. So if you have stakeholder support from the beginning, then you're going to be able to expedite resources. They may make recommendations, may have different priorities than the IT department. So typically they're going to have the big picture. They're going to have the access to the resources so they can allocate those resources more efficiently. And they can prioritize the actual business process. So make friends with your CEOs, your CFO, your CISO. Make sure that they are aware. Develop a rapport, communication. You want to have open lines of communication with them, so you'll have a much more successful chance of implementing your project. So let's talk about liabilities. So liabilities are a necessary evil of doing business. There's always going to be some legal liability. Basically, it factors into your risk assessment. So is a company responsible for taking certain action or inaction? Who's responsible for the security within an organization? Well, ideally it's senior management, but there may be other blame to go around. And the old saying goes, in the military, you can delegate authority, but you can't delegate responsibility. So ultimately, someone's always going to be responsible for an action. So you have what's called due diligence and due care. These are things that factor into whether or not a company is held responsible if there is a loss. So due diligence and due care are different. Essentially, due diligence means, are we continuously monitoring to meet or exceed security requirements? Are we trying to get better? Due care is the implementation of, so making sure those best practices are actually implemented. So they kind of go hand in hand. So you take due diligence and then you follow that up with action. And then you have the prudent man rule, or the prudent person rule, acting responsibly and cautiously as a prudent person would. So did you do everything in your power to stop, data from being exfiltrated by the attackers? Did you do everything to enhance security? And so this goes into making sure that you're using best practices. Depending on the industry you work in, whether you're healthcare or your credit card industry, there's different best practices to be aware of. So let's talk about the organizational security policy. So this is you might call this a program policy. The bottom line here is that your organizational security policy should include a high-level statement from management with mission goals. So it should also support the strategic goals of the organization and any legislation, regulatory, industry considerations. So it also assigns responsibility as to what each department is supposed to do. The organizational security policy should be integrated with all business functions because it allows you to make sure that you've thought about things from the perspective of your customer. That's really what the organization is. They end up becoming like your customer. So also there needs to be an enforcement and accountability piece. If the policy has no teeth, then it's very much likely not going to be followed. So if people are aware of the policy and they know there's no punitive component, there's no consequences for their actions, then there's going to be no point to it.